and he honks at me to back up. It's a narrow street, so I back up, and I back right into the guy behind me. And so he runs out of his car screaming, but he runs straight past me and screams at the bus driver. And then he comes and gives me a big hug, because we are brothers in the war against bus drivers. Thank you. I first should say I'm disgusted by all of you. With Matthew Ricard, spiritual elevation gets no rise out of the audience, but Richard Gere, a hot guy with gray hair, American gigolo. Obviously, I've come to the wrong audience to talk about character. I've got a lot of work to do. Pay attention. I'm here all the time. If I come more often, they're going to make me pay rent up here on this stage. And I know that I have to be brief in front of the 92nd Street Y audiences, because you didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourself speak. So I'll try to get out of the way. It's a circuitous route for me, not too long distance-wise. I grew up in Stuyvesant Town, downtown. I went to Grace Church. I was part of the all-Jewish boys davening choir at Grace, where we would sing the hymns, but to square it with our religion, we wouldn't sing the word Jesus, so the volume would drop down and then come up. And so I was like a little choir boy, a soprano. I was somewhat on the left then. In 1965, my parents took me to a be-in, where hippies would go just to be. One of the things they did, they threw their wallets in the garbage can to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire, so I grabbed it and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. And so that was one shift. And at that point, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, though that came when I was 7, I was visiting a friend's house in Peter Cooper, and we were reading a book, Paddington the Bear. I decided I wanted to be a writer. I remember in high school I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy, and I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so that turned that way. And then in college, some of you may know, I went to the University of Chicago, a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And I sort of had drifted away from religion and Judaism. I got married to a woman who was then secular, and after we were married for a little while, my then wife converted to Judaism. Then she announced she wanted to keep a kosher home. She became the mikveh lady at the synagogue. She wanted to send her kids to Jewish schools. And I remember thinking, God must exist, because only he would go so far out of his way to screw me this badly. So now Israel is a larger part of my life. My son, as some of you may know, serves in the IDF right now, and has increased the connection with Israel. And so you feel this odd connection. We were just there and visiting him, and the trip before, I had what I thought was the quintessential Israeli experience, which was I'm driving down the street in Tel Aviv, and a bus is turning, and he honks at me to back up. It's a narrow street, so I back up, and I back right into the guy behind me. And so he runs out of his car screaming, but he runs straight past me and screams at the bus driver. And then he comes and gives me a big hug, because we are brothers in the war against bus drivers. And then another bus comes by, totally unrelated. He breaks away from me, and he starts screaming at that guy. And we become intimate friends. And that's what I love about Israelis, is they don't understand the distinction between public and private life. Everyone is sort of their cousin. I had a friend who was this was back in the day when you called directory assistants to get a restaurant. He was calling for the number of a restaurant in Jerusalem, I think called Ocean. And so he called up the operator and said, "Can you give me the number of the restaurant Ocean?" And she said, "Nah, you don't want to eat there." And so there's an intrusiveness there. And Israelis are rough on the outside and sweet within. Sometimes it takes a little while to find the sweet part, but actually you should all come back for Ari Shavit, who is definitely rough on the outside and sweet within. This book evolved sort of, I mentioned how life changes. And there are moments that are unexpected when life changes. And for me, some of the moments, I've had this amazingly fortunate life, some of the moments are really nice moments when life changes. I remember about 10 years ago, I was driving home I was doing the NewsHour. I do a segment with a guy named Mark Shields, which we want to call Brooks Shields, but they call Shields and Brooks. It was summertime, so it was light when I got home at about 7:15, and my kids, who were then 12, 9, and 5, were in the backyard, and we had a driveway that pulled around the side, and so you could see into the backyard. And so I pull in, and they have a little ball they've gotten. You get the supermarket, these 99-cent balls, and they're kicking it up in the air, and it's a kind of ball that curves, and they're chasing across the yard to who can get the ball first. They tumble all over each other, grabbing the ball, laughing. And the wind the sunlight is coming through, the evening summer sun is coming through the trees, the grass is green, they're laughing and rolling about. And I'm just sitting in the driveway unexpectedly with this beautiful tableau in front of me. And it's one of those moments when life and time are suspended, when reality spills outside its boundaries, and you get a feeling of being overwhelmed with gratitude. And you're sort of subsumed in a beauty that you have not earned. And this sense of getting more than you deserve elicits a sort of strange stirring. It plows open hard ground so you get beneath the normal exterior you build over the course of your life. It gives you a glimpse of a higher joy, which you never get in your career. It exposes depths, but the strange stirring calls forth a desire to be worthy of what you've been given. And so I felt this strange stirring at that moment. I remember thinking, I want to be a little worthy of this. Sometimes you're around people who give you a strange stirring. They radiate an inner light. A couple of months ago, I was fortunate enough to be seated next to the Dalai Lama at a restaurant, at a luncheon in Washington, and he's a guy who radiates an inner light. Matthew Ricard, who I've met a few times, also does. The Dalai Lama, he laughs at odd moments, and so you're just sitting with him, and he'll start laughing, and you want to be polite, so you laugh back. And then he'll laugh, and you laugh, he'll laugh, and you laugh, and you feel like someone should be saying a joke in between the laughter just to... And so I was sitting with him at this luncheon, and I said, and he had a little canvas Dalai Lama bag, and so I said, you got any candy in that bag? And he starts pulling out what's in the bag, and basically every item you get in the first-class cabin of an international flight is in that bag. So like the little eye shades, the ear things, the little razor, toothbrush, and then he pulls out a Toblerone bar. So he did have that. But that inner light, you want to be worthy of that. You'll say, wow, these guys are amazing. And he's famous. I was in Frederick, Maryland with women who teach immigrants how to read, and sometimes can take up to 7 years to teach them English and then how to read. And I went into a room of about 30 of these ladies. They were mostly between 50 and 70, I guess. And as soon as you walk in the room, you feel a joyfulness there. They radiate gratitude, they glow with love and care, sort of musical laughter. When you talk to them, they make you feel funnier and better. Their voices are calm. They're not talking about what great work they do. They're not thinking about themselves at all. And being around those people also makes you think, I've achieved way more career success than I ever imagined I would, but I haven't achieved that. I don't have that. And you want to be worthy of that. You've only got one life. You might as well try to be one of those people. And occasionally there are people you meet who help you more than you deserve. And in this community, when I think about New York and some of my friends here, I'm friends with a man named Yossi Siegel, who has a wife, Rachel Siegel. They live across the park. I'm friends with a guy named Roger Hertog. I'm friends with a guy named Meir Soloveichik, who's the rabbi across the park. And those people have helped me at different points in my life more than you deserve. I remember we had lunch with Meir, my friend and I had lunch with Meir several months ago, and he was surrounded by his kids. It was a Shabbat lunch. And he started to tell a story that his kids had all heard before. And instead of being jejune and sarcastic, they were bouncing in their seats. This is a good one, this is a good one. And there was just a joyousness to that. And so there are moments of pure joy. And, I'm in a job where that doesn't reward that. I'm paid to be a narcissist and a blowhard and to volley my opinions. But nice to be able to be like that. And so the way I think about that is that there are two sorts of virtues, which I describe in this book, the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. And the resume virtues are the things you bring to the marketplace. Are you good at journalism, doctor, lawyer, teacher? I've covered the Jewish trifecta there. But then there are the eulogy virtues, the things they say about you after you're dead. Are you honest, brave, courageous, capable of great love? And we all know the eulogy virtues are more important than the resume virtues, but we live in a culture that rewards the resume virtues and pays more attention to the resume virtues than the eulogy virtues. And a lot of us are more clear of how to develop a career strategy than how to develop good inner character. And I've talked about this before from this stage, but one of the books that really helped me think this through was Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's book that he wrote in 1965, The Lonely Man of Faith. And Soloveitchik says that there are two accounts of creation in Genesis, and that these two accounts represent the different sides of our nature, that each of us has two sides to our nature. Adam 1, what he calls Adam 1, majestic Adam, is the career-oriented, ambitious side of our nature. Adam 1 wants to build, create, produce, and discover things, perfectly legitimate side to our nature. Adam 2 is what he calls humble Adam, is the internal Adam. Adam 2 wants to embody certain moral qualities, wants to have a strong inner character that honors creation and one's own possibilities, wants to have a solid sense of right and wrong, not only to do good, but to be good. Adam 1 wants to conquer the world. Adam 2 wants to obey a calling and serve the world. Adam 1 asks how things work. Adam 2 asks why things exist and what ultimately we're here for. Adam 1 wants to venture forth. Adam 2 wants to be anchored in home. And so Soloveitchik's point is that these two sides of our nature are in confrontation, but sometimes they work together. Having good character can produce good career success. Sometimes they're in tension with each other. I have a friend who does a lot of job interviews, and he asks this question to all the interviewees: name a time you told the truth and it hurt you. There are sometimes having good inner character is bad for your career. Moreover, these Adams live by different logics. Adam 1, the creating, building, resume Adam, it lives by an economic logic, which is straightforward. Input leads to output, effort leads to reward, practice makes perfect. Adam 2, the inner logic, the inner Adam, lives by an inverse logic, a moral logic, which is found in the Bible. You have to give to receive. You have to surrender something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. You have to conquer your desire to get what you crave. Success leads to the greatest failure, which is pride. Failure leads to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. In order to fulfill yourself, you have to forget yourself. In order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. Now, we live in a culture, and certainly in a city, that nurtures Adam 1 and neglects Adam 2. We live in a society and raise our kids for a college admissions process that is very competitive and demands all of our attention. We live with fast and shallow communication that makes it harder to hear the soft, still voice from the depths. We live in a culture of a big me that wants us to be marketing ourselves, social media that wants us to like ourselves and put little highlight reels of ourselves on Facebook, and a moral culture that teaches kids and adults they're really wonderful inside. A lot of adults are going to be giving as commencement speeches this book, Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss, and it's about how wonderful you are, and it treats life as a solitary journey towards success. Commencement cliches: follow your passion, be true to yourself, trust yourself, and we tell our kids how great they are. In 1950, the Gallup organization asked high school seniors, are you a very important person? 12% said yes. They asked the same question in 2005. It wasn't 12% who thought they were very important, it was 80%. Psychologists have this thing called the Narcissism Test, where they give people a bunch of statements and they say, does it apply to you? And they're statements like, I like to look at my body. I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. Somebody should write a biography about me. And the median narcissism score has gone up 30% in the last 20 years. They do global comparisons of people who take this test, and of all the countries in the world, we're number 1 in narcissism. Serbia is number 2 and Israel is number 3. It tends to be Asian cultures that are come out, and the most humble cultures, along with Morocco and Switzerland. With the desire for narcissism has gone an increased desire for fame. UCLA did these studies of college freshmen. Fame used to rank low in what they wanted in their life, 15th or 16th. Now it's 2nd or 3rd. They asked a bunch of junior high school girls, would you rather be a celebrity's personal assistant, be around famous people, or be president of Harvard? And by 3-1, they'd rather be like Justin Bieber's personal assistant than president of Harvard. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. My favorite study of this is they asked college students, would you rather have a life that leads a lot of fame or a life that involves a lot of sex? And by 2-1, they wanted the famous life. And so I'd go to colleges and I say to students, you know, I'm on TV twice a week. I write a column in a prominent newspaper. I'm sort of famous. Go with the sex. It's better. And so, but this is the culture we live in, a culture that values resume, that emphasizes resume, is comfortable talking about Adam 1, and it's just not that articulate about Adam 2. I'm not sure we're a bad society. We just don't talk about it as much, and we're not as clear about it. And if you do live that way, as certainly I've been guilty of, you lack a quality of inner depth. You lose the ability to speak with a sophisticated moral vocabulary about what's going on in your own life. You live with an unconscious boredom, not really attached to the highest purposes of life. You slip into a self-satisfied moral mediocrity. And that's certainly been true in long periods of my life. I found I graded myself on a forgiving curve, proved myself so long as I was not obviously hurting anybody. And slowly you end up turning a core piece of yourself into something a little less impressive than you had originally hoped. There becomes a humiliating gap that opens up between your desired self and your real self. You don't deserve the eulogy you wanted. And so I set out 4 or 5 years ago to see, you know, how can I get the inner light? How could I be a little better? How could I at least move in that direction? And I knew from the get-go that writing a book doesn't get you there, and reading a book doesn't get you there. But I thought at least if I paid attention to people who had gotten there, I would learn the roadmap. And so I decided one of the things I learned early on was that character is not something it's not like a little iron figure that you have in yourself. It's not like that Victorian idea of character, a little solid iron guy who's filled with self-control who tells you not to resist temptation. I came to see that none of us is strong enough to resist temptation on our own. We all need redemptive assistance from outside. And so character is really the strength of your commitments. A person of character, in the realm of the intellect, they have a settled commitment to fundamental truths. In the realm of emotion, they're enmeshed in unconditional love. In the realm of action, they're committed to activities that can't be completed in a single lifetime. And so I came to realize that the book and the key to the character was not a bunch of abstract philosophical ideas. It was creating an assembly of friends, people who could inspire me and hopefully inspire readers and set as models and exemplars, and who could be in a sort of conversation. We all have friends of a sort, but we also have friends who are dead. We have dead friends whose lives are gifts they've left to us as models. And so I sort of gathered a collection of friends who serve as examples and exemplars of different things that I think are necessary if you want to lead the deepest sort of life that you aspire to. One of those friends is a woman named Eisenhower, who was born in 1862 in Shenandoah, Virginia. Her mother died when she was 5. Her father died when she was 11. She was an indentured servant for a neighboring family. One day when that family was out, she just walked away. She walked to Staunton, Virginia, put herself through high school, memorized 1,365 Bible verses during the first 6 months of school, graduated from high school, is a lone girl in the mid-19th century, decided she wanted to go to college. She hitched with a caravan and got herself out to Kansas, found herself in college there, completed college, married a guy named David Eisenhower, gave birth to 6 sons, one of whom was Dwight Eisenhower. When Ike was 9, he wanted to go out trick-or-treating, but Ida wouldn't let him, so he punched a tree in his front yard. He was so angry. And he rubbed all the skin off his fingers. Ida let him go cry for an hour in his room. She came up to him, bound his wounds, and recited a verse. He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city. And when Dwight Eisenhower wrote his memoirs 70 years later, he said that was the most important conversation in his life because it taught him he had a problem in himself. He had a sin, which was his temper, and he needed to conquer it. And he really spent the rest of his life trying to do that. We think of him as this garrulous country club kind of guy, but inside he was roiling with anger. In World War II, in the presidency, he would lie awake at night, insomnia, anxiety attacks, drinking, throat infections, blood pressure spiking. But he developed a series of strategies to defeat his own anger. Some of them were stupid. He would write people's name he hated on a piece of paper, rip it up, and throw it in the garbage can. But in this conquest of himself, he became a very strong person. Thomas Merton wrote, "Souls are like athletes. They need opponents worthy of them if they are to be tried and extended and pushed to the full extent of their power." And he created quite a strong soul by fighting against his temper. And what we learned from Ida Eisenhower and from her son Dwight was the importance of self-defeat. Adam 1's chief struggle, his chief drama of the resume life, is the external drama for success, the external struggle for success. But Adam's 2 core drama is internal. It's the internal drama, the struggle against one's own weaknesses. And the people who learn from that, they go home at night, what is my core sin? How does that lead to other sins? How does that lead to behaviors I'm ashamed of? And what am I going to do about it tomorrow? And that sense of self-confrontation is core to the moral drama. And so that's a lesson from one friend. A second friend, and all my friends have, in this book, have one thing in common, which is at age 20, they were sort of pathetic. But by age 70, they were sort of magnificent. They were self-made, or at least they were made and not born. The second is Samuel Johnson. Johnson was born in 1709 in England, barely survived the ordeal of his birth, handed over to a wet nurse whose milk infected him with tuberculosis, which made him permanently blind in one eye and deaf in one ear. He developed smallpox, which left him scarred across his face. When he was a boy, they did surgery on his jaw, which left his face partly carved out. They opened his arm to bleed him, and they left the wound open for 6 years. He developed what looks like Tourette's syndrome, OCD. He couldn't control himself, whistling, jerking around. It was a challenge to eat with him because he was spewing food everywhere. He went to Oxford for a year and failed, tried to open a school and failed. By age 30, he said his life was radically wretched. He'd failed at everything. And he was, frankly, sick, large, ugly, and ogre-like. He went to London and tried to make use of what he'd learned. And what he'd learned was something he'd learned from suffering. We should never want to suffer. There was sort of a failure chic that went around for a little while, where everyone was bragging about how failure was great. It all derived from a Steve Jobs commencement speech at Stanford. And failure is great if you're Steve Jobs. But sometimes just destructive. But you can take suffering and turn it into something productive if you turn it into radical self-awareness. Paul Tillich wrote that people who endure suffering are reminded that they're not the people they thought they are. He wrote that what suffering does, it carves into the basement of your soul and carves through the floor, revealing a cavity below, through that floor revealing a cavity below. And suffering introduces yourself, and in that way creates humility. Humility is not thinking lowly of yourself. It's radical self-awareness from a position of other-centeredness. It's seeing yourself from a distance. And so he developed humility from that suffering and also empathy from that suffering. He walked to London with a guy named David Garrick, who became a great actor, and he started writing, freelance writing. And he wrote to improve himself and to solidify himself. And he wrote to tie himself down. He couldn't control his own mind. He couldn't control his own body. He needed some stability in his life. So he thought, if I grasp the truth, I'll have something solid to hold on to. And mostly what he did was he wrote about the world around him, but he wrote about his own sins, his own life. He had a radical curiosity. He was told that there's a section of a river in Oxford where a lot of people were drowning, so he jumped into that section just to see what it was like. He was told that if you put 2 balls in a pistol and shoot it, the gun will explode. So he put 7 balls in and shot it against the wall. His last sayings show a man who has an extremely realistic view of life. His famous sayings, you know them all: patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. A man of genius is seldom ruined but by himself. If you're idle, be not solitary. If you're solitary, be not idle. He wrote essays about all the problems that plagued him: sloth, envy, guilt, boredom, sorrow. Sorrow, he wrote, is a kind of rust of the soul that is only cured by work. And slowly, by sheer force of observation over the years, he built himself into something really solid. One biographer wrote, the iron had entered his soul, and he approached questions of human conduct in the light of a terrible experience, which enabled him to penetrate into human motives with sureness and understanding. He performed amazing feats of writing. It took the French Academy 40 scholars and 50 years to do the first French dictionary. Johnson did it alone with 6 clerks in 8 years. He did get free writing for his friends. He had a friend who was a law professor who unfortunately knew nothing about the law. So Johnson said, I'll write your law lectures for you. And he wrote 60 lectures stretching over 1,600 pages of text. Just did it for free. And he took people in. He was part of the most famous social club maybe in English history with Adam Smith and Edmund Burke. But at home, people who had nowhere else to go could live with him. And there were always 10 or 12 people living with him: former prostitute, a former slave, doctor with no money. There was a largeness and a generosity of spirit. And so these 2 things went together. One, the ability to see very clearly, to quiet the self and get the ego out of the way. And then the ability just to be funny, but also to be humane. And when he died, one of his colleagues said, he has made a chasm which not only nothing can fill up, but which nothing has a tendency to fill up. Johnson is dead. Let us go with the next best. There is nobody, no man can be said to put you of mind of Johnson. And so what he teaches us is to take those moments of suffering and turn into humility, which is radical honesty and radical self-awareness. John Ruskin, hero of mine, once said, the more I think of it, the more this conclusion is impressed upon me, that the greatest thing a human soul ever does is to see something and tell what is seen in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. Just the act of getting yourself out of the way and seeing the world accurately. And that's how Johnson formed himself. The third friend is a woman who lived downtown here named Dorothy Day, who was one of these figures who, when she read a book, she couldn't just read a novel. She acted like the characters she read about in the novel. And unfortunately, she read a lot of Dostoevsky. And so she's living on the Lower East Side, and she's drinking a lot, carousing a lot, hanging around with gangsters, living in a garret, abortion, suicide attempt. Then she moves to Staten Island, and she gives birth to her daughter. And as she's pregnant, she realizes all the accounts of childbirth she's ever read were written by men. And so she decides, I'm going to write one. And so like 45 minutes after giving birth, she writes an essay for the new masses. And a lot of it is about the violence of the process. But at the end, she writes, if I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, painted the most beautiful painting, or carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I often felt after the birth of my child. With this came the need to worship and to adore. Again, the sense of being given more than she deserved. That turned to religious faith. She became a Catholic, and she spent the rest of her life with building communities. A friend of mine, a guy named Christian Wyman, who's a great poet at Yale, says love is always in motion. It's always overspilling. And so the love for daughter overspilled and went out into others. And so she wanted to help the poor and embrace the poor. And so she formed a radical left-wing newspaper called The Catholic Worker, soup kitchens, shelters, rural communes, and she spent the rest of the many decades of her life in poverty and serving the poor, trying so hard not to become proud of her service, but to embrace simplicity and poverty. She became very famous, very inspirational. People were admiring her. And she would write in a journal. And the more I think about this process, the more I think journaling is important. Radical self-honesty. She would write, "I have to stop myself. I have found myself rushing from one person to another, soup bowls and more soup bowls, with the gratitude of the hungry becoming like a loud din in my ears. The hunger of my ears can serve as someone else's stomach hunger. The joy of hearing these expressions of gratitude can turn into a sort of pride." And so she was so self-critical all through her life, worrying about pride, worrying about self-admiration, knowing she needed to embrace poverty to create community. And she serves as an example of the skill of self-criticism, but also using love as a solidifying force and a way to build community. The fourth friend is a woman named George Elliot, who you all know, the great novelist. She was born at the start of the Victorian era to a mother who was too frail to take care of her. And as a result, George Elliot, who grew up with the name Mary Ann Evans, was emotionally needy to an extreme degree, voracious in the need for love. If she was not the center of attention at any party, she could be counted on to have a hysterical fit in the middle of a party just to get some attention. She fell in love with every guy she met. Old, young, tall, short, married, unmarried. She fell in love with them all. And they would sometimes be interested in her because of her brilliant conversation, but then their wives would send her away. When she was 32, she fell in love with Herbert Spencer, a philosopher who was her intellectual equal. And she wrote him a letter that was once pathetic, but also sort of impressive. The pathetic part is in the beginning where she says she's begging him to marry her. And she's like, "You know, if you marry me, you won't even notice me. I won't be around much. I'll stay quiet." And it's pleading. But the end of the letter is impressive. She writes, "I suppose no woman ever before wrote such a letter as this, but I am not ashamed, for I am conscious in the light of reason and true refinement that I am worthy of your respect and tenderness, whatever gross men and vulgar women may say of me, that I'm worthy." And there's a moment in lives where people decide, I don't really need the external affirmation from others. I have my own criteria that is built up, and you call it an agency moment. And that was the moment she developed her own internal criteria of what was worthy and what was not. A sort of sureness, of philosophical sureness of proper and improper, and what she would do for love and what she wouldn't do. It didn't work out with Herbert Spencer, but she fell in love with a guy named George Lewes, who was another writer. Lewes was legally married to another woman named Agnes, but they were not really married. Agnes was living with another guy and had born 3 children with the other guy. So she was off over here. But legally they were married, and this is Victorian England. Divorce is not allowed. She decides if she's going to live with Lewes, and she realizes she will be labeled a slut and adulteress, and she will be cut off from society. Her family will eliminate her, her friends will drop her, and she'll never be invited. She took about a week to decide, and she decided to go with Lewes. "I have counted the cost of the step that I've taken and prepared to bear without irritation or bitterness, renunciation by all my friends. I am not mistaken in the person to whom I have attached myself. He is worthy of the sacrifice I've incurred, and my only anxiety is that he should be rightly judged." They went off to Germany. Back in London, all hell broke loose. She was renounced. But she illustrates some of the virtues of love to reform lives and to deepen character. The first thing love does is humbles you, reminds you you're not even in control of your own brain. Love is like an invading army that you want to be conquered by. The second thing love does is it plows open hard ground. You can love more if you do love. The third thing it does is it decenters the self. It makes you realize your riches are not in yourself, they're in another person. The fourth thing it does is it eliminates the distinction between giving and receiving. when you give your friend or your lover a present, you get more pleasure than they do because your selves are merged. And that's the sort of idealistic, romantic love that Taylor Swift sings about. There's another love which comes later in life, and by the time she's with Luz, she's in her mid-30s. The love that sometimes happens after marriage, sometimes happens for people who are a little dented by life, who have commitments, but who are realistic. They're not starry-eyed about it. The person they're in love with, they see that person clearly and they see themselves clearly, but they still make the leap. And my friend Leon Wieseltier captured this mature second love in a wedding toast to Samantha Power and Cass Sunstein. This is part of what he wrote. This kind of second love, he wrote, is private and it is particular. Its object is the specificity of this man and that woman, the distinctiveness of this spirit and that flesh. This love prefers deep to wide and here to there, the grasp to the reach. When the day is done and the lights are out, there is only this other heart, this other mind, this other face to assist in repelling one's demons or in greeting one's angels. It does not matter who the president is. When one consents to marry, one consents to be truly known, which is an ominous prospect. And so one bets on love to correct for the ordinariness of the impression and to call forth forgiveness that will be required. Marriages are exposures. We may be heroes to our spouses, but we may not be idols. And so that's a very particular, very realistic, very vulnerable second love. And she chose well. She and Luz stayed together. About months later, Luz said, you might try your hand at fiction, which she'd never done. She came back a week later with a short story she read aloud to him. He started crying. He understood her talent. And then he spent the rest of his life, putting his literary career second and becoming her agent, her publicist, her editor. She was very sensitive to criticism, so he'd get up early in the morning, go through the papers and cut out any articles that mentioned her. And the beauty of their relationship is measured in the inscriptions she wrote to him at the publication of each of her novels. Adam Bede, in 1859, she wrote, "To my dear husband, George Luz, I give the manuscript of a work which would never have been written but for the happiness which his love has conferred upon my life." Felix Holt, in 1866, from George Elliot to her dear husband, this 13th year of their united life, in which the deepening sense of her own imperfectness has the consolation of their deepening love. Middlemarch, 1872, to my dear husband, George Henry Luz, in this 19th year of our blessed union. So Elliot is an example of how love can stabilize a life, how commitment to something outside can create integrity, can lay down habits and traditions of empathy, and gave, in her case, an amazing awareness and an amazing ability to read into other people's minds. There's no character so unattractive in a George Eliot novel that she can't put herself in that person's mind and let you see the world from their point of view. And so these are some of the friends who illustrate different steps, I think, whether it's the ability to enjoy or to endure that second kind of love, whether it's the ability to commit to community, whether it's the ability to defeat yourself, whether it's the ability to develop a radical self-awareness, which is humility. But all these people form a different kind of culture than the one we live in, than the Adam 1 resume culture. We are descendants from a romantic tradition that says we have a little golden figure inside, we're good inside, and that we should live our passion, trust ourselves, be true to ourselves, do what feels right. That's a tradition that places tremendous trust on ourselves. And that's our modern world. It descends from Rousseau. It descends from Carl Rogers and humanistic psychology. Free to be you and me. I'm okay, you're okay. There's an older tradition, stretching back to the Bible, which says, first of all, we don't live for happiness. We're endowed with an immoral imagination, which is a spiritual urge to make something meaningful and good out of life, which sometimes involves suffering. We don't live for happiness, we live for holiness. Second, we're not naturally good. We're divided creatures, we're both deeply broken and splendidly endowed. Third, the struggle against our own weakness and sin is the central drama of life, not the external climb to success. In this struggle, humility is the greatest virtue. Pride is the greatest vice because pride blinds you to your own weakness. Character is built over time during the confrontation with yourself. No person can achieve self-mastery on his or her own. We all need redemptive assistance from outside, from our people, from our friends, from our community, and from God. And so my own conclusion is that to develop character, you have to step outside the culture we're in, into a counterculture described in the Bible, whether you have faith or not. It's not clear Lincoln had faith, but he knew the words in this counter-tradition. Immanuel Kant said, "From the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was made." This counter-tradition is based on that idea that we're crooked timber. And I'll introduce you to a final friend who I was talking with some people in the cocktail session before, Augustine. He was born in 354 in the town of Thagaste, which is now in Algeria. He has a mom named Monica, who's the helicopter mom to beat all helicopter moms. She's like all over him, do this, study that, do your homework, don't go out, don't go to the bear fights, don't go to the Coliseum, study, don't marry her. And she had a devouring love for her son, just wanted to be around him all the time, dominate his life. He tries to get away from her, go to Italy. She's screaming on the shore as his boat is leaving. She gets on the next boat, she follows him. And then finally, when she's 56 and he's in his mid-30s, he becomes the sort of man she wants. And she says to him, you know, all my life, I've wanted to be a certain sort of man, and in their case, a certain sort of Christian, and you've become that. And so she says to him, you know, I was thinking I might want to live to get back to Africa, but I realized God is everywhere, so I can die here. And 9 days later, she does die. And so Augustine describes their final conversation in a garden in a town called Ostia. And he says that after years of conflict, they were finally united. That they experienced, he wrote, the very highest delight of the earthly senses in the various material light, in respect to the sweetness of that light. Their intimacy did, quote, by degrees pass through all things bodily, even the very heaven when sun and moon and stars shine upon the earth. We came to our own minds and went beyond them into the realm of spirit. And then he has a long talk, a long sentence, which is very hard to read because usually long and complicated, but it has one word that repeats, and that word is hushed. And he says the sound of the air was hushed, the wind in the trees were hushed, the birds were hushed, our voices were hushed, our heartbeats were hushed, our spirits were hushed. And you get this sense of beautiful tranquility. And Adam 1 never experiences that because in worldly ambition there's always something else out there. But Adam 2 does. And so I think this is sort of where the inner light comes from a deep tranquility and acting in the world out of that deep tranquility. And that's something that I think probably takes decades to achieve. Probably being a newspaper columnist is not the best way to get there. But it is available to us, I think, for all of us, that no matter how old you are, whether you're retired from work, there's still so much Adam 2 work to be done. To identify what your core sin is, how did I do it today, who to admire, how do I surround myself with friends living and dead, how do I process each day as a moral occasion, do I have discussion groups with my friends, and do I live in a culture and help contribute to a culture where this sort of thing is talked about? There was a time from this stage in the 1950s, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Martin Buber, Uptown, Reinhold Niebuhr, there was just morality was part of public discussion. That somehow has faded away, and now we just have a bunch of political pundits. And so my hope is that one of the things we can all shift is to think more about Adam 2, think more about the eulogy virtues, and ultimately change the conversation a little so that the public culture is more balanced for those growing up. Thanks very much. now we can talk about Ted Cruz. No. I think, Susan, I think there are microphones somewhere out there, and I see one, too, and then there are various shuls across the universe who are tuning in, who will somehow get their questions to me. Come on. Nobody wants to walk up to these microphones? I see people approaching.
So you say you have hope, which is very encouraging. Do you think our leaders, such as a president of the United States, can help with this whole theme that you're writing about and speaking about tonight? Do you have hope that leadership will help us get there?
Yeah. I guess I'll say two things. One is the Samuel Johnson character, he had a great couplet, which I'm going to mangle. Of all the things that human hearts endure, how few are those that kings can cause and cure. And so what he meant, a lot of things that are in our life are beneath politics, are more important than politics. And I do defend the ground that's not political. Having said that, I think 2 points. I do think at some level statecraft is soulcraft, that government can create the conditions for people to think about their inner lives or to encourage good values. Some of those are with legislation that encourages decency and citizenship and respect. Some of those are with legislation that encourages a certain level of financial security, so the stress is diminished. And the final thing to be said is they're just the raw power of example. Our presidents especially do set the moral tone for the country. I've covered White Houses since Reagan, and the character of the person at the top sets the tone for the whole administration and in some sense for the country. And so as we think about the candidates this time, I do think it really is very important to measure them as characters. If you agree with the candidate or not, if you agreed with Richard Nixon's every policy, it doesn't matter, because if your character screwed up, your Watergate will come. With this president, I think he's a man of good character. I don't agree with him, but he's on a lot of issues, but I think he's a man of integrity who treats staff well, who has had no scandals in this administration, basically. And I wouldn't say I've praised the virtue of humility. I wouldn't say he's naturally my exemplar for humility, but I do think he's a man of some certain moral rigor and standards, and that radiates from the administration.
In regard to the resume man, one of the things I've been interested in is the idea that Denmark is supposed to be the happiest country in the world, and that their social values are based on not your place in society, such as doctor, lawyer, teacher, but on that you are working in something that you love to do, and that reward is what is going to lead to your happiness. Do you have any ideas or thoughts about Denmark, or have you looked into that study?
I have a Danish friend who's here. I'm not going to call him up on stage. I hate the place. No, I'm kidding. I do know some things about happiness just from research that I've not done but accumulated. The first thing is that money correlates very poorly to happiness. Up until a certain income of like 75, 85,000, it leads to happiness, but after that it sort of flattens out. Second, age correlates somewhat with happiness. People are happy in their 20s, and then they slide down and hit their bottom at age 47, which is called having teenage children. And then they go up again, and the happiest years are the 10 years after retirement. But the big thing is that contributes to happiness is social connection. That if you join a club that meets just once a month, that produces the same happiness bump as earning more than $150,000 a year more. So a club that just meets once a month. And so if you live in a society rich in social capital, which I imagine Denmark is, then your happiness levels are going to be higher. And so it's just about how strong are your connections. How well do you know your neighbors? And one of the troubling things, I don't think we're a country in decline, but one of the troubling things about this country is the radical decline in social trust. One of the things people are asked about is, do you trust most of the people around you? Do you think most people around you are trustworthy? And for most of American history, there were 60, 70% majorities that said, yeah, most people around me are trustworthy. Now it's like 20% think most people are trustworthy. And the group that is most trusting are people over 70, and the group that is least trusting are people in their 20s. And so there's been this just decline in trust. And that's got to have an effect on a lot of different things, but among them, happiness levels.
Mr. Brooks, I have spent the last 35 years working with people in career transition and have had the privilege of, I hope, helping them exploit a time when they're relatively discontent. And I just want to suggest, I think you can have the experience that you described in a career if you hook your choices to who it is that you want to be remembered as being. I sort of see it as my job to help people understand what's going to be critical to their success and see if that's who they want to become. And I would just appreciate your comments on that.
Yeah.
Because you
Well, could
Yes.
you explore what are the common problems when people, they're in a career transition, they've either been fired or disillusioned, I'm gathering. And
Yeah,
then
that's
you're-
right.
And so what are the common problems they have, and what is a typical piece of advice that they...
Well, first of all, let me say this is generally an overeducated, over-optioned group. They have done very well, and they are not in any extensive sense of the word going to suffer financially. They have typically, as most of us do, chosen a career based on early influences, scholastic track, parental pressures, and they're making their way to what is going to be more authentically who it is that they want to be. They've realized they don't like big law firm life, or they don't want to sell their childhood or their young years to the highest bidder. And so they're working through who it is that they want to be, having come up against something that's making it difficult for them to see friends, to build relationships, to have any control over their lives.
Interesting. So I had a student, I teach at Yale, and I had a student, I have a lot of military people in my class. I had a student who was a 40-year-old colonel who'd done 3 combat tours in Iraq. And one of the things he did was every time he moved to a new base, every 3 years, he and his wife sat down and they decided to discuss everything in their life. Are they happy with their marriage? Are they happy with the way they're raising their kids? Are they happy with the Army? And they just went down to the studs and started all over. And the second thing he told me was that for one of his tours in Iraq, he had a terrible superior who gave him nothing but bad feedback. And during that time in his life, he had to come up with his own criteria for success. He couldn't rely on anybody else. And he said, I had to really not rely on criticism, affirmation, just what did I believe? And he said, I call that maturity, and I've never met anybody under 30 who could do that. And so, you know, I suppose most of us in midlife come to a certain self-awareness finally and see if the career matches. I would say 2 things. One, to be for Adam 2 is not to be against Adam 1. It is to realize that both parts of your nature exist, and hopefully you can find a job where they are both realized. And just to be self-conscious of your Adam 2 needs, which are often, it sounds like in the case of many of your clients, moral imagination, moral aspiration, a feeling they want to go achieve some worthwhileness and not just be a cog in a law firm. And so that's the first thing to be said. The second thing is the best thing I ever did with my column is that I asked readers over 70 to write life reports. And it was grade yourself on how you're doing in different aspects of your life. And some of it was personal life, professional life. And people gave themselves on average in professional life an A-, and in personal life on average a B-. And some of the things you learned were obvious. Of all the people who wrote in, about 5,000 wrote in, except one, everybody was glad they took all the risks they did. So just lean toward risk is a banal, obvious point, but it is a worthwhile reminder. The people who were happiest divided their life into chapters, sometimes artificially. Every 7 years, I'm at this phase, what do I want to do now? What does this phase mean? The people who were unhappiest, they live each day as just a succession of other days. And so I guess what your people are going through that reinvention process. And I've certainly discovered at my age, and 53, 3, that a lot can change radically in a very short period of time, and we rarely meet people who are not embracing of that change. So my final piece is that everyone should quit their jobs and swap with the person 3 rows ahead of you. Thank you.
I recently saw a T-shirt that I wanted to give my 20-year-old son, and it read, "Be the person your dog thinks you are," which I loved because he came to me recently and said, you know, this ambition thing is really overrated. And I saw the impact it had on our family. I just want to be happy. And what I also wanted to say back to him, well, is that really the reason that you're drinking so much? You know, I wonder how you take sort of the new spring, right, and say, there's really good parts of that philosophy. Now, what does being happy mean? So, from your perspective, how do you link, you know, happiness with character, so happiness doesn't mean narcissistic pursuit?
Yeah, and I find, and there's a lot of data on this, that especially young people, they're wonderful. I think it's a very impressive. My students are very impressive and wholesome, and really amazing kids. Nobody at my age was as impressive as my students are, all of them. But they've not been given a moral vocabulary. And so there's a sociologist named Christian Smith who asked college students around the country, name your last moral dilemma, and 70% of them could not name a moral dilemma. So they said, I pulled into a parking space, I didn't have enough quarters. And he said, well, that's sort of a problem, it's not really a moral dilemma. But they hadn't been given the structure that a moral dilemma is when 2 values collide. That just hadn't been part of the curriculum at school. And so he said what they resort to is emotivism, which is I do what feels right for me. If it feels right for me, then I can do it. If it feels right for you, then you do it. It's all based on personal feeling. And if our morality is based on personal feeling, we really can have no moral discussion. It's just everybody's valid. And it turns into a sort of an easy relativism. And so I think they're living in that world where they work so hard to get into college, they haven't been given a moral vocabulary. If anything, they've been told, come up with your own value system. Well, if your name is Aristotle, maybe you can do that. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to, A, show them the different moral value systems that are out there to choose from. There's a Roman one based on courage and honor. There's a Jewish one based on obedience to law, a Christian one based on grace and salvation. There's a scientific one based on reason. There's Stoics. There's all these different traditions in our civilization. We don't have to tell them what to choose, but here are some options. Think about it. And then I think what that does is it elicits what's innate in all of us, which is this spiritual urge, not only to be happiness and live our life getting drunk all the time, though that's fine, but to live a life of worthwhileness. And so, one of my students at Yale, he just says, we're so hungry. We really want to lead good lives. And that's why I make the distinction, which I really got from Rabbi David Wolpe, between happiness and holiness. And holiness involves struggle and pain to achieve that. But almost nobody, given the choice between a life of holiness and a life of happiness, would choose happiness. I think we all have an innate desire to be holy, to be righteous, even if it involves a lot of moments that are hardship. I'm happy to brag about my kid, but he's joined the IDF, not because it allows him a lot of freedom to get drunk all the time. It involves a lot of struggle and pain, but he wants to lead that kind of life, and I think almost everybody has that urge.
Mr. Burke?
If you want to speak, the microphone would be the...
Mr. Burke, I'm up here at the Peanut Gallery.
Oh, I didn't know there was a peanut gallery. Okay, we'll go to the peanut gallery.
But a very enthusiastic peanut gallery. I want to thank you for probably the best homily I've heard in a decade or in 20 years. And I think everyone here shares that feeling in one way or another. I'd like to also thank you, not just for the best homily I've heard in a very long time, but for the homilies or for the blessings you and Mark Shields bestow on Friday evening to the American public.
Thank you. If you're Jewish, you should not be watching on Friday evenings, but that's Thank you. No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're most welcome. And what I'd like you to do for just a few moments, as long as you're comfortable, is talk about how you feel about the important work you're doing on Friday evening with Mark Shields, the important work you're doing when you reflect on the outcome of elections with Judy Woodruff during election time. It is very important work. Maybe some would say it's a mitzvah, but it's really a blessing for this country to have you and Mark reflect as sensitive fellow citizens about where we are and where we're going. Could you talk about that work?
Okay, well, thank you. First, I really appreciate that. I would say a couple things. One, Mark is just a wonderful man. We've been doing this 13 or 14 years together, and I've never seen him in anything less than just being wonderful. And so he exemplifies a certain sort of demeanor in public life. I used to do it before Judy with Jim Lehrer, and he was also one of, I had these heroes here I mentioned to you. They're all dead. If I had to list living ones who embody that integrity, Jim Lehrer would certainly be on that list. And he set a standard of behavior. And so when I first started going on the show, you can't see Lehrer's face when I'm talking, but I can. And so when I'm saying something cheap or egotistical, his lips curl down. When I'm saying something he approves of, his eyes crinkle with a smile. And so I spent the first 10 years under him trying to avoid the lip curling down and get this crinkle and the smile. And without saying a word to me, he was my instructor on how to be. And I don't know, how much we say makes sense, but I do think one of the things we try to do on the show is to exemplify a certain sort of conversation, and hopefully it can radiate out. Sometimes on TV, I think that nobody knows what you say, but they know how you say it. And I do think if we can do that, it's at least some contribution to the conversation. And the tone was set by Robin McNeil and Jim Lehrer, and the rest of us are just following in that tradition that they've set out. And so I have questions from the greater shuls of the universe. Here's one from Sally. Is your connection to character at all related to your Jewish upbringing? Whether it was religious or secular, I would bet there was an emphasis on menschlichkeit. Somebody else can translate that for me. I stink at Yiddish. With that in mind, why are there no examples of Jewish people of exemplary characters in your book? Because Elliot Spitzer, no. They're actually, there was a Moses chapter, which got cut by me. And maybe I should have kept the Moses chapter. It had it was about Exodus. And in the class I teach based on the book, it's actually one of the better weeks when we talk about Exodus. And Moses is interesting because he's said to be the meekest man on earth. And if you take the leaders that were around in classical culture, they were Caesar, they were Hector, they were Achilles, big, bragging, boasting kind of heroes. And he represents an entirely different tradition. A hero who, when asked, when given the job, says, I don't really want it. I can't really speak that well. And who tries to get out of it. And this is a different sort of leader, a humble leader. And in the Jewish writers in Roman times did not know what to make of Moses, because they had a certain image of what a hero should be like. And it was not somebody who was humble. And it was not somebody who was a shepherd for 40 years. And so they invented all these stories. The years he went and became a shepherd, they said he wasn't really a shepherd. He became a great emperor in Ethiopia and conquered all of Ethiopia. And they made up these stories because they couldn't handle a humble leader. But what Moses exemplifies is this trait of both self-doubt, self-awareness, but also some courage. He does argue with God quite a bit. And what Exodus is a very radically honest view of human nature. And I talked about the crooked timber of humanity. Exodus is a very accurate description of what people are like. God has just separated the Red Sea. They're like 2 weeks into their walk. It's like, let's go back. They're like, God is continually manifesting himself. They like don't believe. Like most of us, we saw a few miracles. We'd like, okay, he exists. But they're backstabbing, they're griping. It's just a very accurate reading of human nature. And so I had that chapter, and then I took it out because Moses is not a historical figure the way the rest of my figures are historical figures. And maybe that was right or that was wrong. I will say one thing about Jewish upbringing, secular or religious. It instills in you a sense of the door of a door, from generation to generation. That each generation is the recipient of this incredible inheritance of times gone by, and that the generations come by are living in us. A great sense of traditionalism to look back, a great belief, as we do on Passover, that when you retell the stories and the heroes of the past, they are their own form of moral instruction. So I would say that the whole book was in some sense shaped by two institutions, that Jewish literary upbringing and then the University of Chicago.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful evening. When I heard and saw you on Charlie Rose last week, it brought to mind a play on words of the funeral oration from Julius Caesar, that the evil is buried with someone and the good lives on. And how do you talk about characters like Henry Ford or Richard Wagner, who in their life are extolled as great virtues, but on another hand, did such terrible things to people and stand for something that is evil?
Yeah, well, I'm a big also believer in Reinhold Niebuhr, who wrote that man is his own central problem, and that Reinhold Niebuhr was like charging forward into battle, waving shades of gray. Everything was always gray. That people were always sinful, but they were also blessed. And there occasionally you'll get a figure in history who's black, Hitler. But most people are gray. And some people are boldly black and boldly white. I was talking to somebody yesterday about Andrew Carnegie, who exploited people through much of his career, but then offered great blessings in his donations at the end of his career. What are we to make of Andrew Carnegie? Ford, a great anti-Semite. Sort of impressive in what he built. And would I want to have dinner with him? Would I be willing to befriend him? Probably not. But I do think if you take an accurate view of human nature, that we're deeply divided and broken, then you're going to expect that people are going to be weird mixtures of good and evil. And that you'll seem to be the norm, and maybe even in ourselves we're like that. And so, to me, we were just in Monticello with Jefferson's house. What are we to make of Jefferson? Slaveholder, great man, weird mixture. And I think most of us are mixtures like that. And some are just take it to the nth degree. And so I think that's just a lesson in the way human nature is. Let me take two more. We're almost out of time.
Hi, Mr. Brooks. I was wondering, because we're getting into the election season pretty soon, and I was wondering what candidates do you feel exemplify the Adam 2 type characteristics that you were talking about before? And the second part of that question is, how would you suggest we view these candidates in the public sphere to detect these traits that are really essential to picking a leader?
Well, I think you would judge by the advertising. That's really good. The short thing to say is I don't know yet about any of them. But you do get little hints of character displays over time, over the campaign. That's why the campaigns are delicious. You do see little hints, and there are things I did not know about Barack Obama when he was elected that I know now. And I was a huge fan of his, and it wasn't only ideological. I didn't realize how he is very self-confident, one of the most self-confident people I've ever met. But there's also, going along with that, a level of insecurity and a very sensitiveness to criticism that I didn't see early on. And so you learn more about them as they go along. The problem for the politicians, the first thing I'll say is, I cover them, I'm with them a lot. Most of them are more impressive in private than they are in public. They're generally good people because their lives are so miserable. They wouldn't do it unless they thought they were helping the country. And so they're in it for the right reasons, but they're in an awful system where they have to talk about themselves and their own product. And so I really couldn't name any of them that are right now that I think are really outstanding human beings. But most of them probably are pretty, if we met them on the street and they were not running for office, we'd be pretty impressed by them. The one thing that I look for first, I talked about Samuel Johnson's radical self-honesty. That's the first thing in political life that goes. Because they're on public display, they're talking public talking points, the ability to have an internal, honest voice about yourself gets destroyed. And it's, if you got a candidate who has that, at least can say, okay, what I'm doing now is total bullshit. I got to do it, but if they can do that, I think that's an impressive start. Okay, last question.
Hello, Mr. Brooks. As I think I'm hearing you right, you want the nation to begin to talk about this more and more, about our moral character. Yeah. What role do you see religion playing in all that? You see John F. Kennedy, who kind of said, my Catholic religion will remain private. Yeah. And where Barack Obama kind of turned and said, I think it needs to be a bit more open, and we need to talk about religion more upfront than we have than in the past. Where do you see religion and moral character and all that building in nowadays?
Well, you know, I observe when I talk about wonderful people, people with inner light, I observe some of them are religious and some of them are not. But what I do think they all have are moral categories and a way to think about their life. I don't think it just happens. You have to think about it. And in our civilization, at least, those categories tend to come from religion. Words like soul, sin, redemption, grace, those are categories that come from religion. And so Abraham Lincoln, it's very unclear to me whether he was religious or not, but he did grow up with the King James Bible. And he did have those categories in his head as a way to think through things. And the second inaugural, which is, you know, one of the most beautiful pieces of American literature, is steeped in that language. And so whether you're faithful or not, I think the ability to read the Bible and to reflect on its language and what it says, or to read great literature, to read Dante, to read Shakespeare, to read George Elliot, these are just part of the things that give you a vocabulary, give you a repertoire of emotions to deal with moral development. I personally think it's helpful to be faithful. It's helpful to love a God and therefore want to honor him by living in a certain way. But I see so many people who are complete atheists who live way better than me, so it's hard to judge. And so with that ringing defense of religion, I say thank you.